I'm going to continue the chapter South Asia and the Contemporary World. In the previous two presentations, I discussed how Pakistan and Bangladesh witnessed ups and downs blended from civilian to military regimes, and how Nepal flip flopped between absolute and constitutional monarchy and ultimately shifted to democracy. In this presentation, I'll talk about the growth of democracy in Bhutan and Maldives and the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. Bhutan is a tiny and remote Himalayan kingdom wedged between India and China. Monarchy exercised power since 1907, but Bhutan became a parliamentary democracy after elections in March 2008. Hence, today Bhutan is a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary form of government. Until 1950s, Bhutan was an absolute monarchy. Major change came when the third monarch began to share administrative responsibility. In 1953, a National Assembly was established through the King's initiative. The National Assembly passed legislation enacted by the King. The King also granted the Assembly the authority to remove him through a vote of no confidence. The king retained his role as head of the state but gave away his power as head of the government to the assembly. However, political instability surfaced in 1964 when the prime minister was murdered in a dispute between rival political factions, and in 1965 when an unsuccessful assassination attempt was made on the king himself. In 1968, the National Assembly formed a council of ministers. It was composed of the heads of the various government departments and was chaired by the king. In 1971, Bhutan officially ended its political isolation by joining the United Nations. The next king continued the process of reforming the government. The king dissolved the cabinet. He withdrew from his role in the decision making. It was a major step towards democratization as it resulted in the country's transition to a fully democratic government. In 2005, the proposed constitution was revealed. The copies of the draft were circulated among the civil service and local governments in order to receive feedback. The constitution came into effect on July 18, 2008. Political parties were illegal in Bhutan until 2007. In April 2007, the ban was lifted. Over the year, the public was trained in the democratic process through a mock vote, and the country's first official elections for the National Council were held in December 2007 and for the National Assembly in March 2008. This marked the completion of the change to a democratic system. In the three National Assembly elections held since 2008, the people chose three different parties to form the governments. Bhutan completed a decade of competitive democracy with the holding of elections to the National Assembly in 2018. It has transitioned from a hereditary monarchy to a monarchical constitutional democracy. Democracy in Bhutan has indeed matured with each passing election. Now I'll talk about Maldives. Maldives is a small island nation located in the Arabian Sea of the Indian Ocean. The constitution of the Maldives provides for presidential system. Hence, the head of the state and government is the president. In 1965, Maldives attained full political independence from the British. 2 years later, a vote in parliament and a national referendum was taken to decide whether Maldives should continue as a constitutional monarchy or become a republic. People voted in favor of establishing a republic. This ended 853-year-old monarchy and established a republic under the presidency of Ibrahim Nasir. During 1970s, there were political infightings between Nasir's faction and other political figures. Support for Nasir's administration reduced quite a lot. Hence, he fled to Singapore with millions of dollars from the treasury. After Nasir, Mamun Abdul Gayoom began his 30-year role as president in 1978. He won 6 consecutive elections without opposition. In 1980s, a series of coup attempts were made to topple the government without success. Independent political movements emerged demanding democratic reforms. In 2008, a new constitution was approved and the first direct presidential elections were conducted, which were won by Nasheed. Social and political unrest grew in late 2011 following opposition campaigns in the name of protecting Islam. Nasheed resigned from office after a large number of police and army rebelled in 2012. Vice President was sworn in as President. Nasheed was later arrested, convicted of terrorism, and sentenced to 13 years. The trial was widely seen as flawed and political. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention called for Nasheed's immediate release. In 2013 elections, former President Nasheed won the most votes in the first round. But the Supreme Court annulled it despite the positive assessment of international election observers. In the rerun vote, Abdullah Yamin, half brother of the former President Mamoon, assumed the presidency. He suppressed criticism and jailed political opponents. A state of emergency was later declared ahead of a planned anti-government rally. In 2018, the opposition united and put forward a single candidate, Ibrahim Mohamed Sohail, who received a landslide victory and became the president. Maldives is a young democracy. The government needs to adopt a consensus building policy, engage the political opposition, and act like a healthy democratic administration for sustaining democracy. Now I'll discuss Sri Lanka. Today, Sri Lanka is a semi presidential democratic republic. The politics of Sri Lanka reflect the historical and political differences between the three main ethnic groups, the majority Sinhala and the minorities Tamils and Muslims. In 1948, Sri Lanka got independence from the British and established a parliamentary system. In 1972, a new constitution was adopted and it became a sovereign republic. 6 years later, it switched to a presidential parliamentary system. Sri Lanka has a unitary system similar to that of French presidential system and concentrates power in the president. The president appoints and dismisses the prime minister and other ministers and can also dissolve the parliament. Now, let us look into the ethnic conflict. Sinhalese and Tamils are distinguished by ethnicity, language, and religion. The Sinhalese are mostly Buddhist, while the Tamils are predominantly Hindu. Both the groups coexisted peacefully for nearly 1,000 years and worked together for independence. But soon after independence, Sinhalese leaders began to take advantage of their community's huge numbers. The first step was Ceylon Citizenship Act, which discriminated against the Indian Tamil ethnic minority by making it impossible for them to obtain citizenship in the country. Over the next 3 decades, more than 3 lakh Indian Tamils were deported back to India and their population was reduced to 5%. In 1956, the Sinhala Only Act was passed, making Sinhala as the only official language. This was seen as a deliberate attempt to discourage the Sri Lankan Tamils from working in the civil service. Many Tamil speaking public servants were forced to resign because they weren't fluent in Sinhala. In 1958, there were widespread riots between the two communities. These riots specifically targeted Tamil minority that left many people dead and forced many Tamils to relocate to the north. During the 1970s, students were admitted to university in proportion to the number of applicants who sat for the examination in their language. This reduced the numbers of Sri Lankan Tamil students because now they were required to gain higher marks than Sinhalese students to gain admission to universities. In mid-1970s, Tamil politicians began to call for a separate Tamil state called Tamil Elam. in regions of northern and eastern Sri Lanka. Politicized Tamil youth in the north and east started to form militant groups, and one such group was Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, also known as LTTE. In 1983, the LTTE killed 13 Sinhalese soldiers and instigated riots. These riots marked the beginning of the dominance of ethnic conflict over Sri Lankan politics. The government launched a major offensive against Tamil and regained most of the territory in Jaffna Peninsula. The Indian Air Force intervened. It dropped aid packages to Tamils. Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was signed, and under this accord, the Sri Lankan government made a number of concessions to Tamil demands, including limited autonomy for Tamil regions and official status for the Tamil language. India agreed to establish order in the north and east through the Indian peacekeeping force and also the disarming of separatist groups. Most Tamil militant groups laid down their weapons and agreed to seek a peaceful solution to the conflict. But LTTE refused to disarm its fighters. The Indian peacekeeping force soon met stiff opposition from the Tamils. Sinhalese too opposed continued Indian presence on Sri Lankan soil. This led to the Sri Lankan government's call for India to quit the island. Rajiv Gandhi refused to call back peacekeeping force, but he lost the next election and the new Prime Minister Mr. VP Singh called back the peacekeeping force. Support for the LTTE in India dropped considerably in 1991 after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi by a female suicide bomber. The violence continued despite the steps taken to appease Tamil settlements. A ceasefire was agreed in 1995, but the negotiations proved fruitless. The LTTE broke the ceasefire. The government then pursued a policy of war for peace. As violence continued in the north, LTTE, suicide and time bombs were exploded numerous times in populated city areas and public transport in the south of the country, killing hundreds of civilians. The two sides signed a permanent ceasefire agreement in 2002. The government agreed to lift the ban on the LTTE. However, the LTTE disengaged from peace talks and later on carried out attacks in Colombo and on military installations. In December 2006, Sri Lankan government officials announced their plans to drive the LTTE out of the country. On 19 May 2009, President delivered a victory address to the parliament and declared that Sri Lanka is liberated from terrorism. Presently, the LTTE has been destroyed by the Sri Lankan government and the area under LTTE has been recovered. The government claims it has put in place adequate measures for post-war reconciliation. However, in the north, adequate measures are required to normalize the affected area. To conclude, we can say that the story of Sri Lanka has been one of repeated assaults on freedom, equality, and solidarity by the ruling class. The democracy in Sri Lanka is marked with authoritarianism, violence, and corruption. Presidential elections were held in 2019. Undoubtedly, the oldest Asian democracy has survived but weakened.